I'm also now pleased to introduce, although we list him as Edmund J. McMahon, everyone who knows this is E.J. McMahon, who was, the president of the Empire Center for Public Policy, also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a colleague and friend of mine for many years, and really an expert on economic development, tax policy, pension reform. This is a little bit out of his bailiwick, but EJ always comes up with interesting things to say. So thanks, EJ.
Thank you, Russ, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you here today. As Russ said, my name is E.J. McMahon. I'm president of the Empire Center for Public Policy, which is an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan research and education organization based here in Albany. Fostering personal responsibility in the framework of strengthened local communities is a very important goal of ours. And in pursuit of that goal, I would readily admit to a pronounced bias in favor of subsidiarity. That is, that the notion that to the greatest possible extent, social and human problems should be dealt with at the level closest to those problems. There's always a tension in a big nation where there's a major federal funding role, but that's one of, if there's a bias, I would admit up front, that would be it. I'm also a senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, which is another nonprofit think tank based in New York City. My background is that of a public policy analyst with a particular interest in the fiscal impacts and overall effectiveness of government programs. So while I don't have a background in welfare administration, much less nutritional services, I would like to approach the issues surrounding the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program from the perspective of one sort of assessing the broader forest rather than specific bureaucratic branches of the trees. I begin with a basic or fundamental question. Why, or what is the purpose of this program? That is, SNAP. Is it run and designed and structured in such a way that it's really likely to achieve that purpose? Is it pursued in a way that's consistent with other bureaucratic objectives of the government? Or to put it another way, let's consider a thought experiment. If you were designing America's human services programs from scratch, that is, the entire array of assistance and income supports to needy families and individuals in all sorts of situations, would something like SNAP be on your list? Specifically, I mean a program that's supplemental subsidies for food purchases. And having created such a program, if you decided to, would you have it administered not by the Health and Human Services Agency, but by the department dedicated to promoting and protecting the interests of farmers? Yet that's what we have, obviously, and I think it's helpful to consider how it got that way. SNAP's progenitor, the food stamps program, did not originate as a way to feed poor people primarily. It emerged from the Great Depression of the 1930s as an experimental effort to create a more efficient market for surplus crops by subsidizing food purchases by people on relief. Those were the twin problems. The stamps themselves that gave the name to food stamps replaced yet another program, a bulky program of trying to ship surplus commodities to nascent food banks around the country. Now, the design of the original program was interesting and is worth recalling. Poor families were required to purchase a set of stamps colored orange, and they automatically got additional stamps colored blue for free. The ratio is basically if you bought $5 in orange stamps, you got $2.50 in free stamps. That is 50 cents worth free for $1 spent. So while the orange stamps could be used to buy any food item, the blue stamps could be used only to buy so-called surplus food. That is food the USDA secretary had called surplus. So note, from the start, the concept was one in which a cash voucher or stamp was a supplement for food that a needy family purchased with its own source of cash, whether that cash came from relief or some limited employment. The program disappears in World War II. It resurfaces late in the President Kennedy's administration as an experiment. It gets beefed up a bit by the Great Society in 1964, but it really comes into its own and is established as what we thought of or knew as food stamps in 1969. And ironically, this happens at the very moment under President Nixon, when Nixon is losing his fight to create a guaranteed annual income, an entirely different concept. In fact, one of the historians of the food stamps programs noted that food stamps itself expanded into something like a guaranteed annual income, in effect. Richard Nathan, a name very well known in this building, who founded this institute, who was a deputy budget director, then called food stamps a, quote, mini negative income tax, which was another name for a guaranteed annual income program. The concept of providing free food for the needy as a cash supplement remained the basic concept that had been carried through from the late 1930s, and indeed the USDA remained in charge of the program. The ratio became more lopsided, as we know. In '69, when the program got up to its bigger permanent level, the ratio that had been $1 to get 50 cents free now became paying $1 to get $10.60 in food stamps. Now, you know what's happened since, I don't need to go into it in detail, but since 2000, there's been a series of steps to liberalize the program's parameters and eligibility, and there's been a very significant expansion in the caseload throughout the country and in the amount of money spent on the program. And this took place before, during, and after the recession, more or less. Let me review just a few of the statistics just from New York. Since in 1996, when welfare reform replaced the old AFDC program with TANF, there were more than 1 million New York State residents on the old so-called welfare program, and there were about 2 million getting what was then known as food stamps. Fast forward 17 years. In 2013, there's just 391,000 TANF recipients, but the number of SNAP recipients is up over 3 million, or roughly 1 in 6 New Yorkers, 8 times the TANF caseload. The number of SNAP recipients also dwarfed the number of supplemental security income recipients, of which there were about 700,000. SNAP benefits for New Yorkers, not including administrative costs, totaled $5.6 billion in fiscal 2013, which was 3.5 times the amount spent on basic assistance to people on the TANF caseload. SNAP benefits actually even exceeded the combined total of all of New York's TANF and related maintenance of effort expenditures in all of the different ways New York spends the block grant and MOE money, and also exceeded the $4.8 billion laid out in SSI benefit payments. In short, in New York, as throughout the country, SNAP has basically come to replace what was thought of as traditional quote-unquote welfare, as the basic entitlement and broadest entitlement. Like traditional welfare of yore, it's largely unshackled and from any incentive to seek work or welfare to work program. Clearly, this is a good time, and it was a good idea to create this commission to take a fresh look at the program. But I think it should be from a broad perspective in the context of all human services efforts. Reflecting on the name of this commission, and a word we've used a lot today and will continue to use, I can't help but point out that Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines quote-unquote hunger as, quote, a very great need for food, a severe lack of food. Now, we've come a long way in the last few decades. In fact, it was officially more or less proclaimed by the federal government in 1990 that actual malnutrition was no longer the problem which it actually had been as recently as 50 years ago. That what we're really concerned with now is what we refer to today as food security or food insecurity, particularly the issue of very low food security, which I think most people would commonly accept as a definition of hunger as they would know it, which is at different times during the year, the food intake of the household members was reduced and their normal eating patterns were disrupted because the household lacked money and other resources for food. As of 2013, only 5.6% of all households fell into this category, and less than 1% of households with children had a child in that category. Now, to be sure, in a wealthy country like this, any number above 0 in those categories is intolerable. And a proper focus of this commission is in getting that number towards 0, at least to the greatest possible extent, given the vagaries of human conduct and no matter how much money is available. But at the same time, I think it's important to face facts. While food insecurity is a real issue, the larger problem facing poor and non-poor American households is not a lack of calories, but too many of the wrong type of calories. Here I would like to quote from a recent testimony in front of USDA by the welfare scholar Doug Besheroff. He said, he noted, despite the massive increase in overweight and obesity among the poor, federal feeding programs still operate under their nearly half-century-old objective of increasing food consumption. Few experts are willing to say that federal feeding programs are making the poor fat, although the evidence may point in that direction. But no expert thinks that they do very much to fight this growing public health problem. Now, there is an iron rule of government and business, I think you're all familiar with, which is if you subsidize something, people will buy more of it. If you give them money, specifically food, they will buy food. Even in cases, well, we haven't acknowledged, but which do exist, when people may have a greater need for something else. Of course, when you have a program such as this, you are obligated to decide what qualifies as food. That's a great deal of the bureaucratic churn and effort in policymaking surrounds that point. We've been discussing it today. But when you have a single set of rules for an entire nation of 330 million people, you're inevitably going to have state and local officials seeking more flexibility, at least on an experimental basis. USDA has had an odd approach to dealing with such requests. Again, as been noted, New York, on behalf of Mayor Bloomberg, sought a waiver that would have allowed the city of New York to bar the purchase of sugared sodas with SNAP benefits. USDA turned that down. On the other hand, the department granted fairly significant waivers allowing all SNAP recipients in Rhode Island to purchase prepared meals in certain circumstances. It allowed another waiver so that people in Springfield, Massachusetts could get a premium if they purchased healthier foods with their food stamps now, or their SNAP benefits. Now, these are interesting ideas. They sound like worthy proposals. They also, though, tend to strengthen the impression that USDA is more inclined to favor an innovation that will sell more food, rather than being interested in changes that would restrict some purchases. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, while the USDA blocks efforts to prevent the use of SNAP to purchase unhealthy foods, the First Lady has launched a comprehensive initiative to solve the problem of childhood obesity within a generation. Something is wrong with this picture. I am among those who would support converting this program into a block grant, giving states at long last the flexibility and incentive to better manage and design their own programs to help people with the problem of, among other problems, poor people's problem of food insecurity. Now, some states, given this opportunity, might choose to simply convert their SNAP funding into another form of cash assistance. At the other extreme, some states might try to completely replicate the existing SNAP approach on their own. But I do think, undeniably, this would foster the kind of innovative approaches that you've been asked to consider, public-private partnerships with food banks, for instance. Some states, for instance, could steer the money to vouchers for housing or transportation in a way meant to help people who live in what are known as food deserts, a concept I know you're familiar with, where they lack sufficient nutritional choices. There's a whole array of ways in which states might find the freedom to do better with this funding than the federal government does. Now, I understand, or as I can perceive it, the principal objection to block granting SNAP is the assumption that this would mean a reduction to funding and that the program would not grow in line with needs rapidly enough during economic downturns. I don't think that necessarily has to be the case, however. This appropriation could be indexed to rise to inflation, or it could be linked to a rapid escalator so that the cash available to states for the purpose of dealing with the hardships of an economic downturn could basically turn on automatically in times when economic indicators such as the unemployment rate increase. I think those who advocate for the poor have an understandable point when they talk about not wanting to restrict choices as a way, in effect, to preserve people's own individual independence and dignity and to foster it. However, I think that such advocates should reconsider or at least yield to the logic of their position. If you think it's unduly patronizing for some mayor or governor to tell SNAP recipients what kinds of food they can and cannot purchase, why not support elimination of SNAP and its replacement with some different form of assistance managed through a block grant to states? Now, earlier I mentioned, and I'd like to close on this point, the inconsistencies of having a policy that allows the use of SNAP benefits to purchase non-nutritious foods that may be contributing to a health problem, while at the same time launching a major national effort to combat the problem caused by consumption of those foods. Here's another piece of cognitive dissonance. Even as the federal government spends $75 billion a year, I think that's the figure, on SNAP benefits, USDA is administering a variety of programs, among other agencies, designed to promote or even subsidize agricultural activity that produces the opposite result, by devoting large amounts of farmland to the production of crops that are to be converted into biofuels. The use of biofuels increases both the level and the volatility of food prices in the United States and around the world. And who is affected the most by that? Poor people who have food insecurity in some cases. Consider ethanol. 15 years ago, 90% of the U.S. corn crop went to feed people and livestock, with less than 5% used to produce ethanol. By 2013, that number was down to 60%, and 40% went to ethanol. With mounting ethanol mandates in production since 2006, food prices have sharply risen. The use of spent cooking oil as a fuel and other biofuel competes with other uses of this commodity. It can increase its price as a fuel and increase its cost as an input, where it's used in the agricultural business by livestock farmers, for instance, who can spray it on the food they use to fatten their animals, or to other food uses. Biodiesel demand alone has been blamed for an increase of 74 cents per bushel, or roughly 8%, in the price of soybeans. Higher cost soybeans have a ripple effect throughout the economy. Energy markets now regularly compete with the food sector for vegetable oil. Soybean prices and energy prices are statistically linked, creating a floor price for soy oil. So all of these things exacerbate food insecurity. And one of the several federal agencies involved in promoting this is the USDA, in the name of building up rural America and helping farmers market their products. Something is also wrong with this picture. This is a regressive form of tax, in effect. At the very least, USDA should recognize the contradiction in its current policies, although I think Congress ultimately is going to have to do that. Subsidizing the purchases of carbonated sugar water won't help solve the problem of childhood obesity within a generation, as the First Lady aims to do. Mandates and incentives to convert food into biofuel are in no way consistent with measuring the goal of ensuring that all Americans can afford a healthy and nutritious diet. In closing, I would hope you'd reconsider the ultimate goals of the problem, this sort of forest view that I suggested at the beginning. I'm fully cognizant that your formal charge is to make recommendations to the Secretary of Agriculture, and that what I'm suggesting, among other things, block granting, is actually, in effect, would amount to telling the Secretary to get further back out of the business rather than to get more deeply into it and do it better. Nonetheless, I throw that to you as an idea, and I'd be happy to take any questions or enter in any discussion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm actually very interested. You referenced back in '69 when the program really came into blossom and became a nationwide program. There had been some recalcitrance even after that. But that was the time that Nixon was launching his Family Independence Plan, which would have been a guaranteed income program adjusted for inflation. I mean, are you basically saying that had we gone that direction and not had a transfer payment devoted exclusively to the purchase of food, that it might be better and it certainly would respect people's choices?
Well, I think that it'd be interesting. I think one of the benefits of the block grant approach is that different states would approach this in different ways, and you'd see what some of the unintended consequences might have been. You know, reflecting on that and listening to some of the other really excellent testimony today and your colloquies with the previous witnesses, we understand, I think we can all readily understand the politics of how food stamps classically developed. Politically, support for such a program was stronger if it could be sold in farm states as a way to take care of and sell surplus crops, especially in the Depression when that was a huge problem, and it remains an issue. Secondly, and again, a human marketing perspective, when you talk about hunger or you talk about food and feeding people, the most basic human need, that attracts the natural charitable impulse of individuals and institutions, commendably so and naturally so. And it's perhaps harder to say, here, give money to the poor, as opposed to we need to feed the poor. But there is a tension here. I would point out to you, what's the goal of social services and human services programs? We want ideally everyone to be a self-supporting household, supported by their own income and work to the extent possible. There always will be people who cannot be in that position. But the goal is for everyone to be self-supporting, to be working, to be making a wage, and to be supporting themselves. Well, think about it. Those who are, the fortunate many who have enjoyed that status their whole lives, certainly the present company included, and those who aspire to it. When you are in that state of life, your employer, your business, does not generate a voucher for you to take to Price Chopper. You have an income, and you have a family budget, and you see to your food, your most basic needs for food and clothing out of your overall budget. It's only, but in part for the reasons I mentioned, we ended up with a bifurcated program. It's actually broken into many more pieces, as you know, in which food in particular has this separate program run by an agency that really is most interested in promoting the interests of the people who produce food, to give you what amounts to a voucher or a supplemental subsidy for food. Well, once you succeed in getting on your own 2 feet, and if hopefully, and supporting yourself, becoming a self-supporting household, you're not going to be receiving a supplement for your food. You're going to be paying for your own food. And in fact, a great deal of what we hear, I think, in the understandable comments about wanting to preserve the dignity of poor people and their choices, even against arguments against using these benefits to buy unhealthy food, kind of get at that point. So I understand that tension. So that I do think it's that the block grant approach, while it's not completely flawless, obviously, is a way to explore what that alternative history. What would happen if you actually did have more flexibility in how you manage these programs?
I have just one last question. You brought up 2 items at the end that I find very interesting and throw new wrinkles at us. No one really has talked about the issue of food deserts, and yet in Albany here, Albany's tried to rebuild the downtown in many different ways, and now is using a residential model to try to rebuild downtown Albany, and yet there's not a supermarket in downtown Albany.
Well, there's a single supermarket a few blocks away from here, up the hill from everybody who has
condos,
more likely to have food insecurity.
And all the corridor up on Sheridan Avenue and Arbor Hill, which is some of the poorest areas here, that store isn't convenient.
Well, for instance, what you will see is, I live in a suburb south of Albany, and what you'll see are literally people coming by the busload to the Walmart Supercenter to do their grocery shopping from the poorest neighborhoods of Albany. And there are models, for instance, if the states had the flexibility to do this, maybe states would think of trying to figure out ways to incentivize the location of full-service groceries in poorer neighborhoods, where for a variety of understandable reasons they currently do not locate.
Well,
Go ahead, Rob. Do you have a question?
it's not, I have 2 questions. The first concerned the raising of the ethanol issues. We're interested in savings.
Right.
So potential that we could reinvest in more effective ways to help low-income Americans. So is there a savings in federal dollars in a ethanol standard change?
There are some savings. I would say compared to the SNAP budget, they're relatively modest. All money, $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and the first thing you're talking about
It's
real money. I think
yeah.
the figure
Yeah,
I've
we know
seen
that.
for tax credits alone on the federal level, and I didn't double check it before I was here, it was about $2 billion over 10 years.
Well, we'd like to keep our dialogue open on that because you're very good at finding wasteful spending or inappropriate spending, and we might need some in order to reinvest.
Well, there's I mean, think of all the spending that is the added spending that is generated by the cost, which can often be higher, of biofuels, and by the inefficiencies introduced by the use of biofuels.
Right.
It's not an unmixed picture.
The other issue is crop insurance. In the Farm Bill has a huge subsidy for crop insurance for farmers that scholars, for instance, at the think tank I work at have been strongly opposed to because of its wastefulness. That might be another area where we could find savings, and it would be within the USDA bailiwick, in fact, within the Farm Bill.
Well, right, and also, but getting back to the point of the block granting, and anybody who has worked in a large organization or in government totally understands this. Is that if you have a huge amount of money that is spent through the state, but which the state has no incentive to spend efficiently or effectively, it will not be spent efficiently or effectively. This is not about trying to shortchange people in need. This is about recognizing the absolute fact of the matter, which is that if New York is getting $5.6 billion a year from the federal government with absolutely no incentive to ensure that it's spent efficiently, you can rest assured it's not being spent as efficiently as it could be spent.
Last question, how do you react to a regulation that mandated certain shelf space criteria in order to participate in the SNAP program on grocery stores?
Well, I don't know that much about it. I can understand the impulse behind such a regulation. Again, it seems to me that it's one of those endless wrinkles that crop up if you have a program designed the way this is. If you have a program of debit cards that says, here, use this to buy certain foods, and then naturally concerns arise about which foods are available, which foods are purchased, then that type of thing comes up. I mean, I think that in isolation, an argument can be made for it.
Thank you.
You have questions? I have one more. But
Last one, and
Okay.
then we need to have our break.
I just want to be clear on when you're talking about a block grant. You qualified it to make it very distinct from what was done with TANF, because TANF was a one-time fixed lump sum based on admittedly
Right.
a per state basis at high levels of spending.
Yes.
But you're talking about having some adjustability within a block grant, both for downturns and for emergencies and something tied to inflation.
Yeah, because this program, and even going back to its Great Depression roots, you know, the political impulse was that we got to help the farmers sell their surplus produce, and oh, by the way, we've got people on relief lines. Perfect confluence of interests. But it did grow out of the fact that people had suddenly developed real urgent needs for basic necessities when there's times of economic distress or emergency. That makes this different from that, because the notion behind that, which some people are still arguing, but the notion behind welfare reform was this program had drifted away from a focus on getting people back on their feet and into conventional, into self-supporting status, and that it needed to be fundamentally changed. I think this is different, and that block granting, I would have the different approach, because you're talking about the fact that there was a maintenance of effort based on what states were spending in the mid-1990s, and there's that core that you've got to keep up, and then there's this number which is shrinking in inflation-adjusted terms that's the actual benefit.
Right.
This, I think, you'd have to treat differently. And that's why I think that when it gets mixed up with the debate in Washington over deficit reduction, I think that feeds a lot of the concerns we're hearing. If this becomes a block grant, like the TANF block grant, that means it shrinks steadily for years to come, and the money doesn't shift when we need it. But that doesn't necessarily come as part of the package, I don't believe, or should not.
Okay,
Thank you very much, EJ. Appreciate your time. I know you've got other events to get to, and we have a break. Is
Thank
that
you.
right, Mariana?
That's right.
We
You're supposed to, do you want to say?
We have a
have
break.
about a 10-15-minute break, and then we'll resume with Joel
Thank you
Berg.
very much.
We're supposed to